Welcome to Grant Funding, making grant writing work for your organization. This professional development series is ideal for nonprofit, education, and government agency professionals who need to make the most of grant funding opportunities. This series also serves as an ideal education program for board members seeking development opportunities and students and researchers who seek to improve their grant writing success. Session 1 is a free introduction to the world of grants and grant funding.
We are going to begin our training session with answering a few key questions about grants. First, we're going to talk about what are grants. Then, we're going to see what kinds of grants are available, what types of projects can be funded with grants, what types of organizations can benefit from grant funding, and then we're going to dive into, is your organization grant ready? That's a key piece that a lot of organizations really lack, is understanding what it takes to be ready to be a grant recipient, to be ready to be a successful grant applicant. And so we will dive into that and talk a little bit about what it takes to get ready if you're not. Grants are resources allocated for the purpose of solving a social problem. By social problem, I don't necessarily mean problems are always problems. Sometimes problems are needs, right? There are lots of grants out there for cultural or arts or, things that enrich our lives. Those are a social problem insofar as they meet a social need, okay? But for our broad intents and purposes, grants are any funds, any resources allocated to solve a social problem or meet a social need. Grants are one of three main types of funding, and it's really important for us to understand that, right? In terms of government funding, and we'll bring private funding into the conversation, but in terms of government funding, you have direct services funding. This is the type of funding I think we're all kind of familiar with. The things that the federal government or our state government or our city government directly cuts a check for. Things like their employees in the armed services, in the park service, right? NASA. Those are all things that are direct services funded, right? Then there are formula or entitlement funds. We're all familiar with entitlement funds. Entitlement funds show up in the news all the time, right? Those are things like our food stamp program, Medicaid, Medicare, right? Social Security. Formula funds are also a giant portion of the funds that come out of not only our federal government, but also our state government. The best example I can give you of formula funding is our education system, right? The federal government passes money along to the states, who pass money along to the local school districts based on a formula. That formula is based on the number of butts in seats, right? Simply how many students are enrolled in a school, right? Now, there's lots of different formulas. Obviously, there's some special education funding out there. Those get a certain percentage, right? Certain dollar amount. But it's all based on a formula, right? There are certain transportation funds that are based on a formula, right? You don't see formula grants at the city or county level so much as you see those at the federal and the state level. But we're not particularly interested in those. Direct services funding, inaccessible to us. Entitlement funding, not the kind of grants we're talking about, right? There are Pell Grants out there. Those are not the kind of grants that we're going to be discussing, right? Formula funding, again, not what we're after, right? Those are standardized forms that tell you how many people, right? You fill in how many people you're serving, you get X number of dollars. Nothing competitive about that. No art to getting that, right? We're interested in the third type. We're interested in competitive discretionary grants. Competitive discretionary grants are just that, okay? These are specific funds that have been allocated to address a specific social problem, right? That's key to know. specific social problem. Okay? These are allocated not only by government agencies, but also by foundations and private philanthropists. Now, competitive discretionary, two different things, both very important. The discretionary part, right, means that these funds are being allocated to this specific problem at the discretion of the funder. Right? Typically, you're going to see how these funds are going to be directed based on what's making headlines in the news. For example, Federal Department of Education. They have a number of discretionary funds. They move money back and forth between the different buckets of discretionary money each budget year. If there is a school shooting, I can assure you there is going to be more money in the Safe Schools bucket. Right? This is pretty intuitive, right? Now, we're competing for these grants through a grant competition process, right? So if there's a lot of money in the Safe Schools bucket this year, then there's going to be a competition to get those dollars, and we're all going to put together the best proposal that we possibly can to compete for those dollars, and we may win those dollars in a competition, okay? The same thing applies to foundations and philanthropists. They have priorities, but they also are spending those funds, allocating those funds at their discretion, right? And are you competing? Absolutely, right? You're competing for their attention. Your cause is competing for their passion and their allocated funds. Some private philanthropists and even some foundations, they aren't going to have an open competition. They aren't going to have an open call for proposals. Some don't accept any unsolicited proposals at all, right? But you're still competing for their discretionary funding. You're out there in the nonprofit marketplace competing for their attention, and you're hoping you get that call soliciting a proposal from you, right? This is a really important concept for us to kind of lay down as a framework for how the whole process works, okay? I want to make sure that you understand the life cycle of a grant. The life cycle of a grant is a 6-step process. First, a problem occurs. That social problem or that social need, right? The difference between competitive discretionary grants and formula grants or entitlement grants, right, comes down to that social problem. There are entitlement grants out there that address personal problems. If your household can't afford to feed itself, you can't buy groceries, you can go and you can apply for food stamps, which is a form of formula grant, form of entitlement grant, right? You meet the eligibility criteria, then you get X number of food stamp dollars. That is a social problem on one level. The application process is very much a personal problem level, right? We're looking at competitive discretionary grants, which always go to solve social problems and social needs, right? So first, the problem occurs. The problem may have been occurring for the last decade. It may have been here since the dawn of time, but it's probably made a headline somewhere, right? So then money is allocated to address that social problem. May have been allocated by the federal government, maybe your state, maybe your city or county, could be a foundation or a philanthropist. Point is, problem occurred, it got someone's attention, they allocated resources to address it. Fact is, government does very little on their own. Foundations do very little on their own. Philanthropists do very little on their own other than make out the checks. It's the do-gooders in the trenches that actually address the problems. So, The do-gooders get together. Hopefully they've got a grant writer on board. And they come up with their submission to the competition that is held to award the funding that's been allocated to solve the problem. Then, once that proposal has gone out there into the wide world, it will come back with an award letter, and the funds have been received. We've won. We've got the grant. So then we're going to implement the program. We're going to implement the program we proposed in our grant proposal. All right? We implement the program, and then step 5, we evaluate it. We make sure that the strategies that we proposed in our grant proposal have been implemented with fidelity, and we show that it has a quantifiable impact. We have undeniably proven that we have impacted the problem. We have addressed the problem. Have we solved it? Probably not. We never solve problems. Right? We make an impact. We address problems. We evaluate the results. And then we either sustain the program or the program ends. Right? If we sustain the program, that means the problem's still occurring. Funds are allocated again, we compete again, and the cycle continues. That's why it's a cycle, right? There are lots of problems out there that recur. Let's take, for example, teen pregnancy. We can find the best surefire solution to teen pregnancy. We can write it up in a point-perfect proposal, submit it to a grant competition aimed at solving the problem of teen pregnancy. We can be awarded, we can implement the program, we can evaluate it, we can show we have no pregnant teens. Yay, right? Problem solved, right? No. Those kids are no longer teenagers. We got a fresh batch of teenagers coming right behind them. Still got to keep solving the problem, right? That is true of almost every social problem, right? That's why I say we never solve problems. We impact them. We address them. We never solve them, but we try really hard. Okay? Sometimes we do solve problems. Very rare. Next, we're going to talk about what kinds of grants are available. This is a short and sweet little piece of information, but it's an important one. Our favorite kinds of grants are cold, hard cash. The money to do the good work we do, right? We all want that. However, don't discount the value of materials grants. There are materials grants out there. Occasionally, you will find a fabulous philanthropist who'll do something like donate a building to your nonprofit organization. And how much of a financial impact does that have on your organization? It's huge, right? There are also different kinds of materials grants. The best example I like to use is years ago, again with the K-12 school system, there was an AED company, and they were donating AEDs to schools. Now, there was a hook, right? Generally, if you get a brand of AED, you're going to train your people on how to use that type of AED. If you need more, you're going to buy that brand so that you don't have to retrain everyone on all these different makes and models, right? So of course they'd give you about half as many as you need, and you'd have to buy the rest. But nonetheless, those things are very expensive, right? And schools are expected to have them. So for us, it worked out to be a great situation. We still wound up having to buy a lot, but we successfully competed for many free ones, right? Saved us some money. Don't discount those materials grants. They can be impactful to your organization. Now, what types of projects can we fund with these grants that we're going to pursue? Essentially, the sky's the limit. All right? As long as the project that you're proposing, as long as the solution that you're proposing is designed to address a social problem, chances are pretty good there's going to be a grant out there somewhere to fund it, right? The key is matching the right grant to the doing that you want to do. Okay? Now, what types of organizations benefit from grants? Basically, again, sky's the limit, right? Normally, when we talk about competitive discretionary grants, we think about nonprofits, nonprofit organizations, right? However, government agencies can also apply for grants and are often eligible. Education agencies are frequently eligible for most grant competitions out there. Faith-based organizations are eligible for many grants. Even for-profit businesses are eligible for grants in a lot of cases, or can benefit from grant funding in an ancillary way. The example I use for that is that I once had a relationship with a consulting client that was involved with distance learning, distance education, right? They made the equipment that, the projection screens, the recorders, all of this that allowed for satellite campuses in education institutions, right? Well, there were lots of grants out there for education institutions that would allow them to buy the equipment. Well, it made good sense for the company that manufactured the equipment to hire a grant writer on, a consulting basis to write the grants for the education institutions to then turn around and buy their product, right? So there are some ancillary ways that for-profits can get in on that. Also, I'm always remiss if I don't mention 2 federal grant programs out there that are specifically for for-profit organizations. Want to mention those so that as a grant expert at the end of your training, you'll be able to speak to this if you're ever asked about it. There are 2 major grants for for-profits. They're SBIRs and STTRs, right? SBIRs and STTRs are offered by just about every major agency of the federal government, right? It's funds that are allocated, they have to be kind of earmarked to go to small business, and they're innovation funds. A good example is if you develop a better artificial limb, right? You may be able to apply for SBIR or STTR funding, right, to manufacture and produce this innovative limb, prosthesis, right? The issue you'll run into with these is that often if you use SBIR or STTR funding for the research and development of a product, the government may own your patent at the end, right? So those can be unattractive to some entrepreneurs if the end goal is to get rich, right? But if the end goal is to be impactful and to address a problem, and your real purpose is to make life better for society by having this innovation available, then an SBIR or an STTR may be of great benefit to make that happen. Okay? I have mentioned that grants are not intended to address personal problems. They're intended to address social problems. So it stands to reason that most grants are not made to individuals, right? They're made to organizations that address these social problems, these social needs. There are cases where individuals receive grants. Typically, those are scientific researchers, right? Now, obviously, they're not receiving the grant for their personal purposes. They're receiving the grant for their scientific research purposes. And the funds, of course, are then used for that purpose, right? But I like to lay all the exceptions to the rules out there. So generally, the only individual grants made are to researchers. And now for the fun part. We're going to take our deep dive into talking about, is your organization grant ready? Okay? First of all, we're going to ask ourselves, are our organizational documents in order? I recently spoke with a lot of startup nonprofits, and For them, this is critically important information, right? Have you incorporated? Are you chartered? Are you a 501c3, right? That's important. Do you have verification of your tax status? Proof, your 501c3 determination letter, right? Do you have current audits? Do you have access to your budget documents, right? These are all important things. Also, there are some administrative aspects that you need to make sure are in good order before you're pursuing grants, all right? Things like, are we using generally accepted accounting principles, all right? Do we comply with all of our federal, state, and local regulations when it comes to doing the business of doing our good work, right? And do we have the organizational capacity and the internal infrastructure in place adequate to implement a grant-funded program with fidelity, right? There's a pretty good rule of thumb here. It's a broad one. We don't want to apply for a grant that's more than our annual operating budget, right? Because chances are we don't have the resources to do the doing. Now, obviously there are a few exceptions. I mean, we can be ambitious, but the idea here is to be cognizant of the fact that you have to have the resources at your disposal to do the doing, and it's not just the grant check. You've got to have the people. You've got to have the knowledge, the expertise, right? You got to have enough hours in the day, right? Another important point here is that most grants, I can't say this strongly enough, most grants do not come in the form of a check in the mail. Most grants are provided on a reimbursement basis. That's why I go back to that rule of thumb about not applying for more money than you have, right? You don't want to apply for more money than you have in your organizational budget, because you're going to have to spend the money to do the things you're proposing to do first. Then you're going to wind up being reimbursed for doing the doing, right? I have seen organizations get really cash strapped in a hurry by pursuing and being awarded a grant that was bigger than they could handle. It is rare that that happens. More likely, you just won't get the grant. If you don't have the resources to back it up, you just won't be awarded. This is why many funders ask to see your books. They don't just want to see the result of your audit. They typically want to see your last 3 years operating budget. What they're looking for in your cash balance is to ensure that you have, on a consistent basis, enough money to do what you're proposing to do on a reimbursement basis. That's a critical point. All right. So anytime you're going to pursue a grant, you're going to want to look at it and see that you have the resources on hand without robbing Peter to pay Paul, right, to do what you're setting out to do. Make sure your budget, proposed budget, doesn't exceed your capacity. Another important point is your organization's grant history. Okay? First of all, do you have a successful track record with past grant-funded projects, right? That's going to go to your credibility. You're going to talk about your past experience with grants in your proposal, right? It's your resume, so to speak, right? Have you had any less than optimal relationships with grants in the past, right? Have you ever had a funder terminate your grant because you didn't do what you said you were going to do? Are you in good standing with all your past grant makers, right? In good standing means there are reporting requirements, right? Some funders want to see a report on a quarterly basis. Some want to see an annual report, right? Some want to see a final report. If someone in your organization, and this happens a lot in big sprawling organizations, you may have a colleague in another department who's applied for a grant from a particular funder who did not file their final report. They're marked, they're flagged with that organization as not being in good standing, right, until they resolve that outstanding report. You may spend upwards of 100 hours preparing a proposal to that organization and have it rejected with no explanation as to why. It may be because your organization isn't in good standing with that particular funder. So you do want to do some due diligence and make sure that all of your past grants were resolved in good standing at the end, okay? I have a horror story for you. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I failed to do my due diligence. I took on a consulting client in the for-profit world, actually, in the solar industry. And if I had done one Google search of their name before I got started, I would have seen that the whole first page of hits were news stories about someone associated with that organization going to jail for doing something that wasn't kosher with a grant, right? They paid me a not insignificant amount of money to write a grant for them. They didn't get it. Now, for me, that's kind of embarrassing, right? For them, it looked terrible, right? A little bit of due diligence, right? If I'd done one Google search, I could have told them to save their money, right? And save a little face, and to try to make right on what had happened in the past so that they could be grant ready in the future, right? Hopefully, very, very few organizations are going to have this problem, right? But it never hurts to do your due diligence and make sure before you get started. There are some ways to maximize your strengths and minimize your weaknesses in this regard, right? The key thing is, if you have an unresolved grant out there, get it resolved. I once sat in a room for 3 solid days with file boxes stacked almost to the ceiling all the way around the room. Fortunately, I was able to draft 4 people to come in and help me dig through these boxes. I discovered in an organization an unfiled final report. It was on an after-school program. We had to go back and try to figure out in this school which kids over the course of 8 years had participated in this after-school program. Get their grades together, get all of their academic performance metrics together, and put together this final report. Well, I had to do it because we were never going to be in good standing to reapply for funding from that funder until I did, right? It was one of the most difficult things I've ever done, right? We're talking burning the midnight oil for days, a lot of people, until we got it done. And it was extremely difficult to reconstruct the data so many years later, right? But it was a necessary evil. At the end of our training series, we will get into post-award considerations and things like sustainability and evaluation. Remember this example when we get there. You do not ever want to be in the position of reconstructing data after the fact. Collect it in real time. So, just to recap, we've talked about our definition of a grant, right? Resources allocated for the purpose of solving a social problem, right? We've talked about what kinds of grants are out there, cash and materials, right? We've talked about what kinds of projects can be funded by grants, right? Pretty much anything solving a social problem, right? Who can apply for grants? Pretty much anybody equipped to solve a social problem, right? And we've talked about what your organization needs to be grant ready. All right. Just to lightly touch on getting into some detail there. If you get into applying for federal grants, and most organizations do at some point in their life cycle, right? You want to make sure that you're grant ready for grants.gov, right? That is a long process. You do not want to start it when you're ready to apply for a grant. You want to start it months before you're ready to apply, right? It's a multi-step process. Each step takes weeks, right? There are things like making sure you're registered with a DUNS number. That's registration through Dun & Bradstreet, all right? Once you get a DUNS number, then you have to register with what was formerly called CCR, the Central Contractor Registry. I do not know what it's called now. It has a new acronym, right? That again takes weeks. Of course, you also have to be incorporated. You have to be a 501c3 or similar organization. You have to have your determination letter from the IRS, right? You have to have your books, your annual budgets going back 3 years. You got to have your audit reports, right? Getting an audit isn't something you do overnight, right? It's kind of this grant-ready groundwork, right? You have to have an EIN, employer identification number, right? Once you have all of that stuff, and that in and of itself is a mountain of paperwork, about 1.5 feet high, right? You get all that stuff done, then you can register with grants.gov. And you go online and you fill in all the forms in the online system, and you wait, and you wait, and you wait. We are used to, in our digital world, filling out an online form, getting a username and a password immediately, right? Grants.gov is a government computer system. It does not work the way the rest of the digital world works. It can be weeks before you get your username and password, all right? So again, we've touched on all of the major administrative functions that make us grant ready. Once we've reviewed all that, we're in good standing, we haven't been blacklisted by anybody, right? Then we also make sure that we go through all of those bureaucratic processes to be registered and eligible to use the systems through which we submit applications, okay? Grants.gov at the federal level is the central clearinghouse. It is the central gatekeeper for federal proposals. However, I will also warn you that there are a few agencies out there, well, kind of most of them, that also have their own proprietary system, all right? You need to make sure you know what those are and get registered with those too, all right? For example, the National Science Foundation does not accept grant submissions through grants.gov. It takes grant submissions through a separate system called FastLane. All right? FastLane then dumps all of the digital information you put into it into grants.gov. Okay? Federal Department of Education uses a totally separate system called G5. G5 doesn't work the same way as FastLane. You submit to the Federal Department of Education through grants.gov. Grants.gov then dumps your information into G5. All right? So we got a lot of digital push and pull here. We want to make sure that our information, and we'll get into that, making sure that our information is digitally user-friendly for all of that pushing and pulling of data that goes on between all these different disparate government systems. All right? For your intents and purposes, you want to be aware of who you're applying to and making sure you've got all of the registrations in place to successfully submit when the deadline comes. And for all of those, I highly recommend starting not days, not weeks, but months in advance of the submission deadline, right? Once we've done all of that, we are grant ready. And we're ready to start picking our project.
I hope you have enjoyed this overview of the grant world and look forward to going through the next 6 sessions of this professional development series. In the rest of the series, you will learn how to build an effective grant writing team, how to use the logic model process to design an effective project, where to find funding, and how to efficiently translate a logic model into a grant proposal narrative to make those tight deadlines. In the final sessions, you will learn tips and tricks for writing a compelling, winning proposal and explore the post-award considerations that will ensure the success of your future projects. To access the rest of this series, please visit our website at www.kfanonprofit.com. Thank you.